Welcome back once again to the Diplomatic Lounge. We are in New York City this time, where I'm spending a few days after attending an important conference of the Latin American Studies Association in Bogotá, Colombia. I was invited there to speak on the issue of conflict resolution, of which I have some experience from my diplomatic career. The first thing that struck me in that very large conference, there were a couple thousands of participants, was that most people were from academia. I was one of the few diplomats in attendance. And you feel immediately that the approach that people from universities have to that very topic, conflict resolution, is very different from the one you experience as a diplomat when you often have your feet in the mud of politics, as I put it, especially when you have some frontline experience, as I have from places like Darfur in the Sudan, during the Balkan Wars in Europe in the 1990s, Haiti, even Nicaragua, etc. People from academia always have an intellectual frame of reference to deal with those issues, but diplomats have to deal with very different realities, and we see it in today's conflicts, especially when some of the participants are not governments or states, but other organizations. We see it in the Middle East with Hamas. And I lived it personally very close when we were dealing with the conflict in Colombia, also the host country of the conference, between the Colombian government and the FARC rebels in 2016. I was closely associated because I was then representing the European Union in Havana, where essentially all the negotiations were taking place. Now, a few of my conclusions regarding any conflict resolution are these. First of all, you have to understand who the parties are and how they function. What is their state of mind? What are their command structures? Secondly, you have to understand what the deeper roots of the conflict are. And thirdly, you have to find a format that's workable to work towards a solution. All three are important. First of all, to understand the state of mind of the parties. In the case of Colombia and the FARC rebels, the main question was, what's in it for them? Why would they lay down arms and lose the respect and the self-respect they have in an armed conflict for a future as a political party? You have to understand the psychology of the people at the other side of the table. I think it's one of the elements that was least understood by people from academia, because they tend to think that when you have a good piece of paper and it's signed, that you are halfway there. Well, the fact is, when you negotiate with non-government partners, what is the signature worth? What is the given word worth? The other thing to understand the deeper roots of a conflict is probably the most difficult. I understood when dealing with the Balkan Wars in the 1990s that centuries-old hatreds were still an everyday reality. And you see it also in Colombia, where a more than half a century-old conflict that started basically like an ideological confrontation, one of the little proxy wars of the Cold War, developed into something completely different. There is not much ideology in the field anymore. It's all about territory, it's all about money, it's about narcotráfico. So these roots are deep, more than half a century old, and they have evolved. And in such complex situations, even wars in Haiti, for instance, where you're dealing with consequences of slavery 200 years later, you cannot hope to find a miracle solution overnight. The best thing you can hope for is that you have stages of implementation that go slowly in the good direction, and that in the end the conflict will only end when there is sufficient fatigue, combat fatigue on all sides to understand that this has to end. And my feeling, unfortunately, was that in Colombia we are not there yet by far. The third point is how do you find a workable outcome? And here I think the present conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas is a very good example of a bad situation, because looking for an outcome in the sense of a Palestinian state is extra difficult because there is no blueprint for a workable Palestinian state. If you add up all those questions, one thing becomes clear, and it was also the main conclusion I had to give as a diplomat in that conference, is that classical diplomacy will have to learn a lot more in terms of flexibility and adaptability to intervene in that kind of conflict. And increasingly, probably, the conflicts of the future will involve many non-state actors, much more than to be classical wars between states and governments, because governments, however bad they are, have some kind of structure and some kind of workings that are understandable to classical diplomacy. But again, we will probably be dealing with many conflicts where that is no longer the case. It was a very enriching experience. And then coming from Bogotá and being here in the United States, right in the middle of the election campaign, again makes it clear how complex politics have become, even in our democracies. And all the things that not just diplomats but also politicians will have to learn to deal with our increasingly complex societies. Thank you, and see you next time around.